I'm Sven Dubie. I'm a trustee with the Cleveland Heights Historical Society. And on behalf of this evening's sponsors of the program, the Cleveland Heights Historical Society and the Landmark Commission of the City of Cleveland Heights, we want to welcome you to tonight's presentation on Coventry Village and Coventry School. It'll feature two of our local experts on Heights history. I didn't even say their names yet. How's that for a confidence booster? Anyway, two of our local experts on Heights history, Kara Hamley O'Donnell and Chris Roy. Before we get started, I just want to, on behalf of the Historical Society, make a couple of quick announcements. First of all, after the presentation, if you didn't notice on your way in the back foyer as you go out the door, there are copies of recent editions of The View from the Overlook, which is the historical journal that the Historical Society produces, and those are free for the taking and for your interest. I also want to give a plug for our annual fundraiser, which is going to be held this year on Wednesday evening, December 6th, in the newly renovated library on Lee Road. It will feature a talk by Professor Marion Mortons, whom we all know, and she's going to be talking about issues in Heights-related history, current and future. So stay tuned for more information with respect to that. Our first speaker tonight is Kara Hamley O'Donnell, and she'll be talking about Coventry Village. Just a few words about Kara. She's a graduate of Miami University, the School of Architecture, and holds a master's degree in historic preservation planning from Cornell University. Kara has lived in Cleveland Heights for nearly 15 years and has been the City of Cleveland Heights Historic Preservation Planner since 1995. She assists residents with historic research, advises them on preserving their older homes, and works on various planning projects. Kara also staffs the city's Landmark Commission and Planning Commission and runs the Cleveland Heights Historical Center here at Superior Schoolhouse. So with that, Kara?
Thanks for that introduction, Sven. And for those of you, I see a lot of familiar faces from the lectures we do here at the schoolhouse, but I also see some new ones. So there is a restroom back through here if anyone needs it. And afterwards, if you'd like to take a peek upstairs at our offices to get a view of the second story of this building, you're welcome to. I'm going to start, I'm taking the part of the presentation about Coventry Village, and this we can discuss later after the presentation, because the definition of Coventry Village, if you ask different people, you get different responses. For tonight's presentation, I'm going to focus on the fact that the village is the commercial district, but I'm going to kind of put it in the context of the neighborhood as a whole. So in the 1800s, this area was not called Coventry, but it was actually parts of East Cleveland Township and Euclid Township, which were laid out as part of the Connecticut Western Reserve. It was a farming and quarrying community all the way through most of the 19th century. And in 1877, the area became sort of the city in the effect that in 1877, the Mayfield Road became a plank road, which meant that it wasn't a mud road, it was wood planks, and it was easily traveled, and it was a toll road. And to give you a perspective of where we are, this is, in theory this should work. This is Mayfield Road right here on the angle here, and this is Coventry, right? This line right here is roughly where Coventry Road is. You see the name Streeter. That was a wealthy Clevelander who used this as his summer estate and harvested all the wood for timber. So it was pretty much an open field at that time. It's just showing the Coventry Road runs right down the middle, sort of between the yellow and the green and the blue. And I'll talk about the developments that took place there. But in the 1890s, the idea of developing this for more than just farming was starting to take place. And these would become some of the subdivisions, some of the earliest subdivisions in the Heights. This map is very old, so it's a little hard to read, but this was the first development in the Coventry neighborhood, which was called Euclid Heights. And this is basically Euclid Heights runs Coventry. Doesn't want to work for me. Coventry, this is Mayfield. Lakeview Cemetery is the darker blob at the top. And then it goes all the way basically down to the Cedar Fairmount area. This was the original layout for Euclid Heights, which was revised in 1898. As you can see, the other side of Coventry, the commercial district is, commercial district is right about here. And you can see a lot of farming. Each of those little squares represents a house. That's pretty much about all there was as far as housing. There was one or two little squares here and there. This is 1892. Euclid Heights is Cleveland's park allotment, was how it was marketed. And this was a newspaper article in the Plain Dealer, and it bragged about streetcar service, which was, there was a streetcar that came up through the Heights on Mayfield Road at that time. And when Patrick Calhoun first came to the Heights, he came to, the legend is that he came to see the Garfield Monument, which had just been constructed, and he came from South Carolina to see that, and then he fell in love with this beautiful view, which was to become Euclid Heights, and decided to develop it. And that was what happened, they say. This would have been the streetcar that came up onto the Heights, that he brought up into the Heights in 1897. And it came up Cedar Hill, up Euclid Heights Boulevard, and it turned around at Edge Hill. That's as far as it went. And it was called the Euclid Heights streetcar. Even this area was called Euclid Heights by a lot of people because Cleveland Heights wasn't yet incorporated. Not until 1901 did Cleveland Heights become Cleveland Heights. This is, if we were standing on Grandview Road, Grandview and Belfield are two of the oldest streets in the city, and they are two of the first paved residential streets. So this is standing on Belfield Road, sort of looking northwest. And this house, this is 1898. This house here was in Euclid Heights along on Overlook. This was one of the first houses built in Euclid Heights, and it was for the architect Granger of Mead and Granger, who was a very well-known architect at the time in the 1800s and early 1900s. So Grandview looks a little bit different now. I love this picture. This is what it would look like as the Cedar. This is sort of standing in the Chestnut Hills section. So this is what the streetcar would have looked like coming up the hill across. That's Overlook, sort of off to the middle left of the screen. And this is how it would have come up Cedar Hill and turned onto Euclid Heights Boulevard. This is Patrick Calhoun's house, which still exists, and it's a Cleveland Heights landmark. It exists on Edge Hill Road. In the lower right is what it looks like today. The porch has been removed and a brick wall built around it. But I think this picture is so interesting because we all know what Edge Hill Road is like now, and this house is just sitting in the middle of a field with virtually nothing around it. And soon after, Patrick Calhoun had the idea to develop this allotment of Euclid Heights, which was to be for the sort of elite of Cleveland. Someone named M.M. Brown, who was from Chicago, came in, and this house is on Euclid Heights Boulevard, just this side of Coventry Road on the north side of the street. It's painted a dark brown now. And this was built around 1900, and his idea was that he was going to have his own development across the street, but his development was to be more for middle-class people. It wasn't these grand mansions, but sort of 50-foot lots with some standard houses. And this is what he said, which I think is sort of interesting because he bragged about how all the improvements had been made to the Euclid Heights property, and don't you want to buy here because it's a lot cheaper? And we'll probably get the developments, the money that they have over there. What ended up happening is a lot of people did buy the lots in his allotment because they were cheaper and they were more working class people. And Patrick Calhoun of the Euclid Heights allotment was very angry and wouldn't let M.M. Brown, who was also a builder, build anything in his development because he was so angry at him sort of stealing his clients. And this was 1896. Then we get into the turn of the century. And this is a 1903 map, and it shows sort of where those two developments sat. You see Euclid Heights on the left, and that goes up to Coventry. And then Mayfield Heights is to the right, and that's there. You also see this land over here, which isn't really subdivided yet. You see John D. Rockefeller owning the property, and John Haycox, who owned a lot of property and owned quarries in Cleveland Heights. But, and you see up at the top, you see John Spence, who was an early leader in Cleveland Heights. About the turn of the century, by 1907, you had many more streetcars. You had the streetcar that came up Mayfield Road. You had the streetcar that went Cedar up to Euclid Heights Boulevard, and by this point it was turning up onto Coventry and then connecting into the streetcar on Mayfield Road heading east. Then you also had a streetcar line going up Cedar, into the Cedar and Fairmount, up Cedar and then onto Fairmount. This is looking from the top of what was Doctors Hospital, sort of at that point at the top of Cedar Hill. So it was getting a little more dense. You see a lot of cars on there. You see a lot of streetcars coming up and down. This house on the far left still exists. Then soon after the development was sort of, the area was getting more dense, there was more access to it, you had a man named Grant Deming come along. And for those of you who know something about the Euclid Golf Allotment, his brother Barton was the developer of the Euclid Golf Allotment. Grant developed what he would refer to as Forest Hill, and that's in the area shaded in the blue. And that little green strip represents the Coventry Commercial District, and north is up to get your bearings. So it was a pretty sizable piece of property. And his was sort of in the middle. There were developments that were sort of for the upscale, and then there was a mix of sort of more middle-class housing within the development. And he also later would run what they called a dinky, which was a streetcar that ran up and down Washington Boulevard, which is why that section of Washington Boulevard is a boulevard. It was a little streetcar that just sort of ran up and forth, so you would, if you lived on the far end of Washington, you'd hop on, and you could take it up to that, intersection at Euclid Heights, and then you could hop onto one of the other streetcars going elsewhere. The problem was that it ran so infrequently, it was quicker to walk oftentimes, so it wasn't as successful, and it only lasted about 8 years. This is a 1913 map, and this sort of shows you what Coventry Village, the commercial district, was like. It was not a commercial district at that time. And so you see Coventry, ooh, wait. I'm giving you a preview. I shouldn't be doing that. Hang on. Oh, wait. Now you're dying to know about the cat, aren't you? This is, you see Lancashire here. So there's a creek. This is a creek. This little crazy road here is a creek going through the middle of Coventry. That's about where, this is my perspective on it, I think. It's about where when you come outside of the video store, oftentimes you can hear the water kind of rushing underneath there. If you look at the map, that's exactly where this creek went, and it was culverted at some point. These are all houses and barns. This is about where the parking deck is. And there's a house here, and there's a house here, and this house is what I'm going to talk about next, and then after that I'm going to talk about this house. And they both had Coventry Road addresses. Oh, and that was the community well. That's where you went for your water, and that's about where the arts supply store is, hardware store is right now. So those two houses are what I'm going to talk about next. The one at the top is next. This house was relocated. It was built on Coventry in 1909, then it was moved to Mayfield in 1919. And this is if you kind of went around the corner and took a right on Mayfield. It's the first house next to that large apartment building, and that was moved to make way for the commercial district. The other house belonged to Mrs. D.R. Smith, who had 20 award-winning cats at her home. Persian cats. The Coventry Cattery, which is where she lived, was built in 2 apartments. The queens have 3 rooms, the stag apartment 4 rooms. They are heated from the cellar by a hard coal base burner. The windows have storm covering for the winter. Each room has electric lights and an enameled lavatory with brass faucets. The rooms are painted in pale blue, and each cat has its own bedchamber screened. There are sunning benches in front of the south windows. So this lady really liked her cats, and she traveled all over Europe to go to these cat stores. This was an article from 06? I'm having a hard time reading it. It's up at the 09. And though the addresses are a little bit different, I'm pretty sure this is her house. And this cement house, the terms say cement house, but it means house means warehouse. So it was sort of a concrete warehouse building, which is, I'm assuming, where she kept her cats. So so this is where you're at Coventry in 1913. This is the kind of place we're living in. And it was starting to wrap up about in 1913, was sort of the end of this pastoral area with no shopping. And this is actually around the turn of the century. This is looking down Cedar Hill. It looks a little bit different now, especially during rush hour. So that's what that looked like then. The question was, if Grandview and Belfield were the oldest streets, why wasn't more development there? And it was developing there pretty much simultaneously to what was developing here. Most of those houses are of the same vintage as this sort of Mayfield Heights area over here. By 1910 or 1912, 13, these areas were pretty much, Grandview and Belfield was very densely populated, and as was this Mayfield Heights area here. If you look at a 1913 map of that area, most of the lots are developed. Okay, so here we are in 1914. This is the Coventry Commercial District. It consists of one building, two buildings really. This is what's now the Heights Hardware building, or not Heights Hardware, Heights Cleaners. Right there, it says two stores. And then this is this apartment building in the lower right section. That was what the commercial district looked like in 1914. Really booming. You could, I don't know, I haven't done the research as far as what stores were at that site, but it's a very utilitarian building, and this shows it, the building in this picture, actually I don't have the date, no, this picture is 1934. And in the background, you'll see the side of that building. And then in the foreground, you'll see another one of the earlier buildings, which is a golf service station, which was built in 1915 at the corner around where Metropolitan's, it's still called Metropolitan Savings, where the bank is. Star Bank? The bank. The 1970s era bank that replaced a couple versions of this gas station. So by 1915, we had a gas station and this service building. It's a little hard to see what it says. I think in another picture, that building says something about ice cream, so it could have been a drugstore with a soda fountain. Here's a picture of this building circa 1975. And this was kind of fun when I was doing this research to sort of discover things. If you look at the side of the building now, you can see right where this is a current, in the lower right is a current picture. You can see right where the billboard was on the side of the building all those years. There's a little words shining through. I couldn't really tell what the words, it's probably that word laundry that's showing through. And the way I'm going to kind of do this is chronologically to kind of just show you how the building, the commercial district grew. This was built in 1918 for the Gannett Auto Company, and it just refers to it as a garage in all the banks, in all the things. This is the Medic building. I was sort of shocked to find out that was one of the oldest buildings in the city because it's very, very utilitarian right now. One of the sort of first grand buildings in the commercial district was the Heights Theater, which was built in 1919. And in 1929, it got something called talk tone or movie tone, which you can see on the front of the marquee a little bit, which was a very exciting time because that meant that they could have movies that actually had sound to them. And you'll see in this picture, which was 36, so it's about 7 years old, the talk tone is on the front, sort of bragging about the talk tone. In the next picture, you'll see that talk tone has been replaced with the theater name again. So by 1941, it wasn't that big of a deal to have a talking movie. And so they didn't really advertise it too much. But they did advertise Humphrey Bogart. I love this picture. Look in the background. I don't remember this building, but I've seen a lot of pictures, and I have a feeling that there are people around who remember this tall building. It's before my time here. But that's where the CoventrYard building is right now. This is another one of the early buildings. This was built the same year as the theater. You found it in the area, in the apartment buildings, and some of the commercial buildings, the word Coventry shows up, or they name it after their mother. There might be the Mary building or something. This one has the word Coventry on it, and this is one of the early buildings. This is where Grum's has been for many years. So this is 1920. Our commercial district still really isn't very much. You've got still got some houses up there. You've got this is the garage that's Medic now, and then you've got right here is having a hard time. This is about where that Heights building is, and then you've got the gas station on the corner. On the left-hand side, which the map didn't couldn't get the map on there. Basically, what you had was the movie theater. That was really it in 1920. And I guess I should preface that with saying, in 1910, the population of Cleveland Heights was about 5,000, and in 1920, it was about 10,000. Am I right, Marianne? 5,000. No, 5,000. 15,000, I think. And then by 1930, and you'll see this in the development, it jumps to 50,000. So the 20s, the Roaring 20s, really, it was roaring in Cleveland Heights at the time. So this is sort of a 1920, what we've got. In around 1920, this is the building that I was talking about. It's right next to the theater. This 3-story building was built in 1920, and it burned in 1978. The first time it burned was 1978. That's a whole lecture right there, the fires of Coventry. This building was built in 1921, and what was sort of interesting for me, this was a new discovery, is this building had the address on it, but I thought it really doesn't look like the building that's there, and I always assumed the building that's there was built later. It was a new addition. But then if you look at it really close, and you can't tell too much in this picture, up here are these little shields. Right, there's these little sandstone, okay. Those actually, I think they salvaged those. They put a whole, if you look down that alley next to it, the old building is all there behind it. They basically ripped the front of it off, put new brick on, but they salvaged those little shields, and they are on the front of this building. So it's the same building, it just looks, this was 3 little storefronts, and now it's 1 big storefront. And you'll see, it sort of shows you when you look at the signs, the A&P was there, the baking company. On this street in the 20s, you had delis, you had dentists, you had a couple of restaurants. It was basically a very service-oriented district. This building was built in 1921. Both of these buildings were built in 1921. And I can't figure out, and I just wish I had more time to keep researching this. Obviously, the building that took its place down there that burned in 1991 is not the same building that was there. And I wasn't able to have the time to figure out when that building replaced that building, and then that building replaced that building. So, and that was the 1991 fire on that site. So who knows? There could have been a fire that took down this first building. I'm not sure. And if anyone knows any information about any of these, I'm happy to hear it after the lecture, because there's a lot of blanks that it'd be nice to fill in. And here you see there's Lily's Restaurant, Hoffman's. I think that's either a drugstore or a grocery store. And this is I still refer to it as the Bike One building, but its name at the top of the screen is the Covham building, or Covham building, because it's at the corner of Coventry in Hampshire. Very original choice of names, I guess. And this was built in 1923. One thing I did want to say, that back in 1922, around the time that all these buildings were being built, we had stores, auto garage, bank, restaurants, dentists. In 1922 was the year that they decided to pave Coventry Road. Up until that time, the road wasn't paved. They wanted to make it wider, but they couldn't because there were buildings on either side. So, which I think is what makes it such a nice district. Had it been a really wide road, I think we would have lost some of the character. This building was built in 1923, and I don't have exact information, but I know that Heights Hardware has been on that street for a very long time. I'm not positive it's been in that exact location. 1916. So they must have been in another building. But it's in 1911. It says on the side of their building, it says however long they've been in business. That's not necessarily saying they were on Coventry all that time either. I don't know the details. This building was, this is a shot from the 1970s, and I like it because you kind of forget what it used to look like before the parking deck was there. I mean, it's a series of pretty simple, one-story, very utilitarian buildings, but you can see this little house. Remember the picture I showed you in 1913 of the houses? This little house is still hanging on in the backyard of all these commercial districts. I'm not sure if that came down when the parking deck was built, or... Oh, did you? You used to live there.
It came down on the parking deck.
Okay. So it hung on for it was sort of the last remnant of those early days before the commercial district. And so you can kind of see what it looked like. This is where the art store is now, and this is right next to the Heights Hardware. You can see some of the banners for Heights Hardware that were on the side. I think that one in the upper right is such a pretty mural. And this was this building was built in 1923 and was later the site of, I'm sure everyone sort of still refers to it as the Irvs building, right? Yeah. So, which later burned also. That's my next lecture. The building was built in 1924, and this is really sort of the standard of what a lot of the buildings on that side of the street were for many years. And it's very utilitarian, but it serves its purpose very well. And this was built in 1924. This is the building at the corner of Mayfield and Coventry. I oftentimes still refer to it as the Taj Mahal building, and I was talking to a class one time and they said, why do you call it the Taj Mahal building? It doesn't look anything like the Taj Mahal. But I said, well, there was an Indian restaurant there for a long time, and but there, you can see here again another drugstore, and this building was built in 1926. And that one's got it has a lot of nice detailing on that building. That's one of the buildings on the street that really has some nice detailing to it. This is the 1800 block between Lancashire and Hampshire. Was built in 1925, one of the later buildings to be built. And I think there's always been a bank at that corner where the bank is currently. And this is down at the other end where for very many years there was a drugstore, sort of the bank and the drugstore bookending the rest of that long block. This was Weinberger's. I'm not sure the date of this picture, but this building was built in 1925. That's where Hunan is currently. And this was another one of those very utilitarian buildings that's had a couple facelifts over the years, and this was built in 1926. It's hard to, a lot of these, the shell of it is still old. This is 1926, so this kind of gives you a sense of where the commercial district is. That picture on the left's a little bit bad, but basically the whole west side of Coventry Road was built up, and virtually the whole east side of Coventry Road was built up. And you still got that little gas station at the corner. And then in 1927, the Ivanhoe with the high-class bowling and billiards club in the basement, which was Dobama the most recently. And I've heard a lot of people who think it would be really neat to have bowling back in there again. It could go full circle. But this is what it looked like when it first opened in 1927. This was in the Heights Press, which was the sort of predecessor of the Sun Press. And here's a picture of it currently with some of the new benches, thanks to the SID. And this is Diamonds Flowers has been on the street for a very long time, and one of the longer businesses that has been around on that block. And this is sort of one of the last buildings is the building that's now a sub shop, and previous to that was Big Fun for many years. And that building was sort of the baby of the district in this era, and that was built in 1933. Okay, now we're in the home stretch. Now is when we get into the pictures that many people will recognize. This is starting in the 1930s. As I said before, basically by 1930, most of sort of first or second range of the buildings being built was complete. This is a great picture from 1934. I just love this picture. There's kids crossing the street. That golf station is off to your right. In the Heights Hardware building, you can see in the Heights Cleaners building, you can see on your right, and you sort of see down there. And for the longest time, I always thought that little white house in the background was really cute, and in an era gone by, it's still there. It's green, and if you stand at the top of the street and look, that house is still at that exact same spot at the end of the street. So some things don't change. Here it is again. Here you can see the streetcar running straight down the middle of the street, and some older cars and that gas station again. Here's the streetcar rounding the bend in the into the 1940s. This isn't a great quality picture, but it really gives you a sense. This is 1949. This is Heights Hardware. It's just there on your far right, and you're looking northward on the street. And what's interesting about this is probably pretty close to the end of when the streetcars ran. In September of 1949, the tracks were removed, and streetcars no longer ran up Coventry Road. So this is sort of one of those last moments. And it really gives you the sense of that change in the grade, which sometimes you kind of forget about if you're not at one end or the other of the block. This is the golf station that replaced the first golf station there where the bank is currently at the corner of Euclid Heights and Coventry. And I think this is such a neat building. That picture's 1952. And then this is this is an aerial from 1953. Mayfield. See, these are nice views. We never get these views. This is Mayfield Road. I think this is sort of interesting. This is where the convenience store is. And Grum's is this long building right here. And so you see that there used to be a building there that was at some point, I think in the late 60s, taken down. So it kind of really eroded that corner of the site. And there was also a lot of buildings on the north side of Coventry, of Mayfield Road, where the gas station and things are that are no longer there. The 60s, in Cleveland Heights, we avoided a lot of things in the 60s, but as far as urban renewal and things, but there were some unfortunate happenings in the 60s. So this is when Coventry got its reputation, really. This is 1960. There's the Heights Cleaners building, and again, you see it was the Heights Laundry at that point. And you're kind of looking down the street, and in the background there you can see the Pick and Pay, which many people remember. I think I've got a close-up picture of that. And this is one of the things that I think is very interesting. In 1964, there was a Supreme Court case that took place that grew out of the Heights Theater, which was Jacobellis versus Ohio, which was a pornography case where they showed Louis Malle's film The Lover, which apparently at that time was very risque, and went all the way to Supreme Court to determine whether it was pornography and whether it could be shown there. And it was the case where one of the Supreme Court justices said, "I know it when I see it." And so that came out of which people always refer to that, and that was a case that grew out of the Heights Art Theater, which was most recently the Centrum Theater. So there was controversy brewing about that in the 60s. This is 68 picture. I think I showed you this before, but give you a sense of there. This was someone's brilliant idea in 1969 to modernize Coventry. You have to get your bearings here. This is so awful. Coventry Road is right here. It's sort of right in the middle of this crazy curve. This curve would have gone probably behind where the parking deck is currently. Basically, it would have decimated pretty much every single building on Coventry Road. The idea of the controversy now. So it's interesting because they planned all these little peg-shaped buildings that were multiple stories, many high-rises basically. And this is some sort of cute commercial building with a bus stop or something they proposed. But a few of those apartment buildings in the middle. This is Lancashire right here, and this is Hampshire. So they kind of looped them together, and luckily, this didn't ever happen. I think most of us probably wouldn't be here today if Coventry looked like that. But this was 1969. At the same time, they had also planned a similar development for Cedar Fairmount, which created a community center that looked like something straight out of the Jetsons. It just leveled the whole Cedar Fairmount district and put this giant oval building right in the middle of it. I should have brought it. It's really horrible. But this shows you, in the 60s, the mindset that was going on in a lot of the country. And so luckily, and this is about around the same era when they were talking about putting freeways through the Shaker Lake. So there's a lot of plans that were planned for Cleveland Heights, and luckily were stopped. But this is 1974, another picture of the Pick and Pay building. This is that building that replaced that real tall building. This is on the left-hand side, and this is in 1978. This is the building on the left that burned in 1991. And this is sort of funny. That one sign, this is Bliss, and I think that's the name of the restaurant. And then there's a little sign that says, "What is an empanada?" It's an interesting sign in the window. But this is the building that was a sort of newer building. And then this burned in 1991. And Then here's another picture. I think a lot of people remember Carroll Drug, and this is from the 70s. And this is where the Hunan is now. This is another picture of that gas station where the bank is now. The saloon, I'm sure a lot of people remember the saloon. And then Pick and Pay, it's sort of modern Pick and Pay. This is in 1977. You can see the marquee at the theater had been changed, and that tall building on your right was newly renovated in 1977. I love this picture. The proud developer stands in front of his renovated building. This is sometime in 1977, and then in February of yeah, that's the back of that building. And then in February of 1978, it burned again. So that's I'm assuming this picture from 1977. It was a pretty new development. This is a Cleveland Press picture. I'm assuming that was sort of an article about this new development. So my guess is it didn't last very long before it burned in 78. And this is what was put up in its place. And that's been renovated over the times too. This was the sort of groovy 70s pictures of the houses on Rock Court, which sort of backed up to the parking lots behind the west side or the east side of the Coventry Business District. For people who don't know where Rock Court is, it just sort of runs parallel but next east of Coventry Road, and there's a handful of houses on it, and I think some of them came down for the parking deck. But this was some artwork that was on them during the 70s. And this parking deck was opened in 1993, which seems like it was just yesterday. And this building was built in 1997 after the fire that took that out in 1991. This is the same shot, some 70-some years apart, and it's kind of hard to see that greenhouse. You can barely see it in the bottom down the street. But you can see, a lot of it's really not changed too much. Even Heights Hardware a few years ago put up a new billboard sign like they used to have in the old days. And this is an aerial photograph that sort of shows where we're at now. And with that, we're going to leave all our questions to the end, and I think Sven is going to introduce Chris, right? And so this sort of shows your perspective, and Chris is going to be talking about the school, which was right about there. And I'll let Sven introduce him.
As Kara said, Chris Roy is going to give the second part of this evening's presentation on Coventry School. Just a few words about Chris. Chris Roy is a near native of Cleveland Heights, having moved here at the age of 5 to escape the overwhelmingly positive influence of his parents. However, I did not write this. However, they followed almost immediately, choreographing his rapid rise through Coventry Elementary, Roosevelt Junior High, and Cleveland Heights High. After that, they gave up. Professionally, Chris is now a freelance business and technology writer, working primarily with international consulting and accounting firms. Evocationally, he is president of the Cleveland Heights Historical Society, a member of the Landmark Commission, and a very part-time graduate student in history, and a vaguely obsessive reader of historical novels. Small wonder that several people believe Chris is history. So with that, Chris.
Okay, anyway, good evening, and thank you again for joining us. Come on. There we go. A lot of you are probably thinking that I'm going to be dragging you along on a very self-indulgent nostalgia trip, given the fact that I was a Coventry School alumnus. That isn't entirely true, although, as I mentioned, I am an alumnus of Coventry School, matriculating without ever knowing what that meant. in 1965. In those years, I was probably the only good kid in the class that was filled largely with miscreants. All right, that's it for self-indulgent nostalgia. The real plan that I have is to introduce or to reintroduce some of you to a really nice, great old school and to periodically comment on how the more things change, the more they stay the same. Here are some direct examples from Coventry School. Take underage drinking, for example. Back then, as now, kids were followers. One person makes a bold choice, and the others line up behind him or her like lemmings. There you go. Styles of dress have also been a problem. It doesn't seem to matter whether it's the 1920s, the 1960s, or the 1990s. Outrageous violations of the dress code, like the ones you see here, probably around 1930, are the likely reason why stringent regulations were enforced until later in the 20th century. Here's an example from a 1965 PTA manual. Neat, clean clothing in good taste gives your child a feeling of well-being and confidence. Slacks or blue jeans on your daughter are permissible for field trips only. Tennis shoes should be worn only for gym. Yeah, that'll fly today. For girls, shorts are not permitted in any grade level. For boys, the wearing of shorts is acceptable only in kindergarten through the 3rd grade. Lastly, there's the problem of tobacco use. In the old Coventry School, the consequences were just about as dramatic as they are now. Foul-smelling clothes, bad breath, declining health, and one of the ultimate tragedies, an unexpected pregnancy. Yeah, the more things change, the more they do stay the same. However, there really are some examples that are relevant to this presentation, I promise. Take Cleveland Heights' long-standing commitment to conflict and protest. To illustrate that, here's the ravine area in the days before Coventry School. This picture was taken from Euclid Heights Boulevard, and the photographer is standing roughly at the intersection of Euclid Heights and Cadwell. Currently, there are 3 large houses behind the ravine. At the time this was taken, there was another large estate, this one, which stood roughly on the site of the little kids' playground behind the current school. It stood until the late 1950s when, following the passage of a 1955 bond issue, the ravine was culverted, upper and lower playgrounds were expanded, and a parking lot was added at the upper lip of the hill overlooking the lower playground. Before that time, Coventry had no parking facilities whatsoever. Here's the estate I just mentioned on a 1929 Sanborn map, immediately below the red arrow. As you can see, the property was huge. It occupied a lot of what later became Coventry School's lower playground. By the 1940s, there were 7 structures on this parcel of land and another house on the parcel immediately to the east. The 3 homes that you see to the right of that red arrow are still standing. Incidentally, the massive structure you see on the lower left to the right of the green arrow, that's the Briggs Estate on East Overlook Road. The map below the solid line is not contiguous with the map above the line, so don't try to follow above and below the line. Anyway, where do you suppose that picture that I showed you is from? It's from a 1917 protest poster decrying the school system's intention to desecrate the community with horrors, an elementary school. Here's what they had to say. Where is our civic pride if we allow this picturesque valley with its forest, which is the only natural beauty spot of its kind in the Heights, to be destroyed by cutting down trees and building retaining walls to make a schoolyard? Is it fair to the people who have come to the Heights and have chosen a section in a highly restricted neighborhood for their homes, and after having spent a small fortune in beautifying the section, to have a schoolyard for their outlook? Vote Saturday, April 14th, to kill the bond issue. Well, here's the reality, why Cleveland Heights needed not one, but 7 new elementary schools during its growth spurt in the 1920s. You'd think with numbers like this that the Coventry Bond Bluebirds would be shot down. Not hardly. Not 1, not 2, but 3 bond issues had to be floated before Cleveland Heights voters would approve the building of Coventry School. Nothing happens easily in Cleveland Heights. Incidentally, that wasn't even the first of the city's public school controversies. 11 years earlier, Cleveland Heights sued the city of East Cleveland to gain access to Shaw High School. We lost. Finally, of course, the forces of reason and education prevailed, and Coventry School was completed in 1919. Here it is viewed from the top of the Heights Art Theater in 1922. As you can see, it sits far closer to the intersection than its successor. It also butts up closely to both Euclid Heights and Washington Boulevards. This became a legitimate bone of contention 50 years later, when the forces of evil began to mass in support of building a replacement structure. There are several other things worth noting about this scene. I don't like this flicker. Looking at the same view more closely, you can see that Washington goes all the way through to the intersection of Coventry and Euclid Heights. In the early 1970s, turning Washington into a cul-de-sac was a key objective of the group seeking to replace Coventry with a newer facility. Looking back, I think that most people agree that that was a good idea. At the center right, you can also see that there's no Heights Library. That structure was built in 1926. Finally, you can see that there's no playground behind the school, just a portable classroom structure, the likes of which often dotted Cleveland Heights school properties, whose buildings seemed constantly to be bursting at the seams. Miriam Green, one interviewee among the oral histories that Kara and her assistants have collected, had a nice mention of these portables that she and her friends were stuck in around 1923. She says, they were like little houses all stuck together with a kind of a tunnel of a hall, and they were all just wooden, one after another, connected by this long hall. They were heated and all that, but they were temporary. So I went to school half the time in temporary buildings in like 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades. So much for the benefits of a new school. So here it is again. Completed in 1919 and designed to accommodate grades K through 8. Beginning in 1926, the junior high school grades moved to Roosevelt when the latter, originally the high school, moved its occupants into the newly completed high school at Cedar and Lee. Anyway, Coventry was built at a cost of $519,000. Given that it held 760 pupils, that means that the building cost was approximately $683 per pupil, roughly what it now costs to send a Cleveland Heights kid to school for 2 weeks. Those in the know would describe the building alternatively as Tudor Gothic or Colonial Revival. Here's a further description of the 1922 issue of the Architectural Forum. The exterior is of salmon buff face brick in mingled shades with sandstone trim. Construction is fireproof with brick-bearing walls, reinforced concrete, and steel interior framing and concrete floors. Composition roof with copper sheet metal. The building actually was so impressive that the company that supplied some of the materials used Coventry in its advertisements. This ad is from 1924. As you can see in these diagrams, the building consisted of 3 floors formed more or less like a capital L with a lump in the middle. The top 2 floors of that lump were the auditorium, and the lower lump was a partly underground gymnasium. Small, dark, and somewhat creepy. Made no less so by a very amiable but old gym teacher, Miss Krebs. Looking at the design from this angle, you can see that the longer side bordered Euclid Heights Boulevard and the shorter side bordered Washington Boulevard. What you can't see is that the Euclid Heights side was a full story lower, and thus one entered the 2nd floor from the street level on the Washington side. Here's a nice close-up taken from in front of the library on the Washington side. You can also see that the main center hall entrance was on the second floor, although I don't believe that these doors were actually used much. That's probably because they went right into the main office, and what kid wants to go near a principal if you didn't have to? In those days, the only contact you ever had with the principal was when you were in big trouble. My favorite shot, though, is an aerial taken in 1969, which shows us several interesting things. One is how close the school actually was to all three of the streets. You can see it in the lower center. Second is how it was designed as an architectural centerpiece, not as a structure for blending into the landscape. Most of us are glad, incidentally, that the present structure does blend into the landscape. Thirdly, you notice how it accommodates the grade of the land. You can kind of see that, how with upper and lower playgrounds. In this photo, taken from the eastern ridge of the lower playground, you can see how a hill of shrubbery separated the lower and upper playgrounds. To the left is a paved pathway connecting the two playgrounds. In the distance by the school, you can also make out a staircase that connected to the upper and the lower areas. That would be here. This is also another illustration of how things have changed for the better. First, the surfaces of both playgrounds were solid cement. Second, no one wore protective gear of any kind. And third, there were no restrictions against bicycling or skateboarding down that hill in the background. Kids would occasionally reach the speed of sound by the time they hit the lower playground. My younger brother's experience illustrates how these three characteristics work together and why I meant it when I said hit the playground. My younger brother was an avid skateboarder, something that I never had the courage to do. When he was about 9, 10 years old, he and his friends used to make a habit of skateboarding down that hill you see to the left and would reach 80, 90, 100 miles an hour on their skateboards by the time they reached the lower playground. What my brother failed to notice one time when he reached the lower playground at the speed of sound was that there was a chinning bar directly ahead of him that was situated roughly the same height as his forehead. And he hit it full speed, knocked him backward off his skateboard, and he spent the next 3 days in university hospitals. I always admired him for that. Here's another shot of the lower playground, this time looking toward Euclid Heights Boulevard. Directly behind the pyramid of kids, you can see a house that bordered Rock Court, which is now part of the parking lot that soon will serve Mark's. At the very upper right is the interesting stucco house at the corner of Euclid Heights and Cadwell that was owned until recently by Isabella Chesler. Here's another rare shot from 1958. The photographer's back is to Washington Boulevard, facing up toward Edge Hill. Put another way, this is the southeastern edge of the upper playground, which had just opened that year. Roughly where the swings and slides are is where the current building sits. Moving inside, it's a little difficult to get excited about a dark old gymnasium that you've never seen, and I do sympathize with you for that. But here it is anyway. What is kind of unique is that there was a permanent spectator area behind the gym that had perhaps 60 seats. Today, it's typically portable risers. Oh, and there's Mrs. Krebs again on the right. She was 145 years old in 1972 when this photo was taken. Here's another inside shot, this time of a typical Coventry classroom in the mid-1960s. Not too much has changed, except for the fact that this room has actual walls. Those classrooms also had closets that we and the teacher referred to as cloakrooms, which calls to mind another way that times have changed for the better. When teachers were tired of hitting the bad kids, which they did frequently, they would sometimes lock those kids in the cloakrooms for an hour or two. Nothing but darkness and wet, smelly coats. I've often wondered if the other children in the class thought to check their coat pockets at the end of those days. Incidentally, the cute little girl at the lower right is my younger sister. I did not realize this until long after I chose the photo to include in this presentation. It's roughly a first grader in about 1966. Inside shots are kind of generic and not particularly interesting, particularly if you didn't actually attend the school, and besides, I couldn't find too many of them. Suffice it to say that by the early 1970s, there were more than a few rumblings about replacing most of Cleveland Heights' elementary schools with newer, more enlightened structures. Around that time, a Coventry School task force was assembled to document concerns about the existing facility and make recommendations about what characteristics should be embodied in the proposed new facility. Here are some of the problems they identified with Coventry. High heating and maintenance cost, poorly situated too close to a hazardous high-volume intersection, bisected by a former creek now encased in a culvert and adjacent to a congested business district. All of these are valid concerns, were valid concerns. Perhaps most noteworthy, though, the panel observed the frustration of teachers working and living within a series of rigid, inflexible spaces. However, I have talked recently to numerous Coventry teachers, and almost all would dearly love the opportunity, at least occasionally, to teach in a rigid, inflexible, that is, fully walled space. Endlessly connected open areas did not represent the planning group's shining visionary moment. In my opinion, it was sort of a warm and fuzzy, come on everybody, gather together and sing Kumbaya kind of thing. Well intended, but a bit too 60s. Anyway, here's the design layout that the task force recommended for Coventry School, most noteworthy for how little it actually resembles what was finally built. I'm not necessarily a fan of the resulting crop of barns, but I do think they are significantly preferable to what you see here. As you can see, all of the parking entrances would have been off of Euclid Heights Boulevard, almost at the intersection of Coventry. Why they would have wanted to exit and enter cars from the apex of the intersection, God only knows. There was also talk of tearing down the 1926 freestanding library and combining it with the school, which obviously did not happen. In any event, the voters of Cleveland Heights passed a bond issue in 1972 authorizing the replacement of not only Coventry, but Boulevard, Taylor, and Fairfax schools. Roosevelt Junior High, Cleveland Heights' original high school, was also given a death sentence with the resulting grounds to become part of the new Boulevard School's expanded play area. Then on March 9th, 1976, Coventry Village lost its anchor tenant, the alma mater of close to 40,000 children. Moment of silence. By the next year, we had a new Coventry school, one that remediated many of the problems that had existed in the old school, but no doubt introduced a few new ones. And now, 30 years after the new school's birth, and 90 years after the boo birds whined about, quote, destroying the only natural beauty spot of its kind in Cleveland Heights, there is yet another Coventry conflict. I guess you could say that it's in our community's blood. Nevertheless, it isn't my place nor the intent of this presentation to editorialize. We simply hope that a broadly acceptable middle ground can be attained and that all the joy we derive from our community can be fully retained. Thank you. At this point, please feel free to launch questions for either Kara or myself, and we will do our best to answer you. John.
So it sounds like because of the delays in getting a bond issue passed for the original Coventry school by the time it was built, they were already moving toward temporary classrooms.
You're talking about the very first. I don't think it was so much delays in the passage of the bond issues as it was just the astronomical increase in the population of Cleveland Heights. It simply grew so fast that the builders simply couldn't keep up with the pace of growth. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that was common at just about every elementary school in Cleveland Heights. So many people remember portables. In fact, behind this, into the 20s, this building was used for kindergarten, first grade, and second grade. And people remembered there was a portable behind here that the kindergartners were in first grade and second grade. So I think they were so common at the time.
It's actually interesting to note that a lot of the fast-growing outer suburbs in the Cleveland area are using portables now because they, like Cleveland Heights 70 years ago, could simply not keep up with their own population growth. I believe Solon has used portable classroom buildings and trailers, et cetera, because they couldn't handle the influx of new students. Anyone else? Sir.
You know what stopped the 69 plan?
Kara? The Gulag plan.
Oh, I have no idea, but needless to say, I'm happy that that didn't go forward.
There is a long article in one of our recent newsletters on it, and I have a feeling that it was simply not a workable plan, that simply made it onto someone's drawing board, but was never particularly well received by the public. It never reached the point where people were lying down in front of bulldozers or launching lawsuits, unlike, for example, the Clark Freeway that Albert Porter wanted to run through the Shaker Lakes. Anyone? Yes, ma'am.
Most of Coventry, is brick buildings, but there are some that have the surface of like tile-like material. What is that, and when did that, when was that in?
Is there an architect in the house?
Terracotta. Those are terracotta tiles, which were popular in the teens and the 20s. It's more or less like a brick with a really shiny glaze on it. And that's on the building where the video store is there at Coventry in Hampshire, or Coventry in Lancashire, and then at the building at the corner of Mayfield and Coventry. That was a very popular building material at that time. It has its own preservation issues now. That tile starts to crack and the surface starts to come off sometimes, and so there's preservation action that needs to be taken. But we do have 2 terracotta buildings in one block, which I think is something to brag about. That's a good question. It was probably produced here. I wouldn't be surprised if Belden Brick or one of those places around here produced it back at that time. It was used all over the country. It was used a lot in Chicago. It was a very popular building material there in the teens and the 20s and even before and after that.
Yes, Mike.
Do you or does anyone here know or remember back to the days and how they decided which of the schools to pull down and replace? What was that, the early 70s?
I don't know what the decision-making process was, and that was something that I was looking forward to researching, but unfortunately my research coincided with the last days of the transfer from the Coventry Library temporary facility. So we weren't able to get in and look at that. Sue?
I believe that at the time they sold it to us based on the building dates, and they were taking the oldest buildings. Is that how you remember it?
Well, we're talking about the library building?
No.
The schools.
Which schools they decided to tear
I
down?
don't know the process. I remember the building with great clarity. What I most remember is a basketball court that stood behind it. I was a graduate student at Case, and late at night could come down here and probably to the huge annoyance of the neighbors, cop a workout back there. I was in flavors of economics that had a lot to do with urban things, and saw the raising of that school as some kind of a monstrosity, but who was I in my mid-20s and busy with graduate school and all. That's the end of my story for now.
You weren't alone, and actually all of the elementary schools, the older elementary schools in the Heights area were torn down with the exception of Roxborough. And Roxborough has always been kind of a unique animal, largely because of its proximity to the junior high school.
Noble in Oxford.
Oh, right, okay.
Canterbury.
Well, yeah, Canterbury's, it was built a little bit later and is architecturally very different. Oxford is true, is one of the old ones too.
Didn't get torn down, all got new windows, and some of them got additions. Canterbury got an addition. They were trying to be equitable and give every community some tidbit.
Anyone? Yes, ma'am.
Was the new Coventry built while the old Coventry was still there?
Yes.
Yes, it was built first.
Thank God for the audience.
And did they take any more land, like knock any houses down? Because the new Coventry seems so much further east than the property
I'm going to
was
repeat the
then.
question. So the question was, I'm repeating these because we're videotaping this for the cable channel, did Coventry, the new Coventry, was it built at the same time as the old Coventry? And we've heard, yes, it was actually built while people were still going to class at the old school, which makes sense for the site, from the siting. And I know the same thing happened at Boulevard as well. In Fairfax as well. So they sort of cited them so that they wouldn't have to transfer kids and move them back. And then the second question was, I lost it.
Yeah.
Take more land.
Yeah, the second question was, were any additional houses taken down when the new structure was built? The answer is no houses were harmed in the building of that school. The last houses to be torn down were during the expansion of the lower playground, which took out the large property that stood just to the east of what was then the lower playground of Coventry School. And that was a massive undertaking that didn't just involve the destruction of a large property, but the culverting of probably 200 feet of sewer. Yes, Hugh?
That large property that you talked about, that house was a early Walker and Weeks designed house.
Makes its destruction all the sadder. But Coventry had a pitifully small playground, and not that that makes the destruction of a historic house necessarily forgivable, but it does explain the need for it.
Tell us about the building of the new playground.
The new playground.
How was that built?
Okay, there are a lot of people here who are far better qualified than I to explain the building of the Peace Playground. But I believe that it was largely a grassroots effort on the part of neighborhood families and parents. And like a lot of playgrounds that were built in the 1990s, they were both constructed and driven largely by the neighborhoods. PTA, Coventry PTA. I know that I was involved in the building of a couple of Canterbury playgrounds, and several people in this audience were very involved in the building of the Peace Playground at Coventry.
600 volunteers from Wednesday morning to Sunday. It's like an Amish car racing. Literally, 600 people built that playground from Wednesday till Sunday with the assistance of a professional company that came in from the East Coast.
Yeah, and several of those people I know are in the audience today, including Steve Presser and Tim Burdick.
So he's saying, I'm repeating again, 600 people between Wednesday and Sunday built that playground. In the year? 1993. In the rain.
Yes, Ken?
Now that the school is going to close, what's going to happen to the facilities, the playground and the building itself?
That is up to the Board of Education.
Yes, Ken?
First of all, that second CoventrYard fire, that, they kept the first floor of the building and totally remodeled it. So that is still the first floor of CoventrYard case here was.
Okay.
3 floors. You can see it within the yard too.
Okay.
Second of all, I wasn't around, I came in '73, but does anybody know what the first, business was on Coventry in the '60s? It was like an alternative lifestyle.
Probably Record
This man has a
Revolution.
big smile on his
Probably
face.
Record Revolution would be my guess.
Nothing started all up
Wait.
there instead of right by University Circle and away from the campus and surprises that fellow.
Well, there was a head shop, that's maybe what you're referring to. It was right about, it was on the west side of Coventry, and it was up right, like where Caribou is now, in that building.
There was also Bill Jones Leather, which tended to be patronized by alternatives.
Well, the Generation Gap.
Ah, yes, very good. Generation Gap. Light of Yoga.
Light of Yoga.
Rain Blue.
There was a
What?
big biker contingent. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, for a long time, those of us who were teenagers in that era remember a very, very distinct dividing line between the west side of Coventry, which was the alternatives, and the east side of Coventry, which was the bikers. And God help the former for trespassing on the latter.
Yes, sir.
I thought for a moment the question regarding what were the first businesses in Coventry, and
I wondered what was the very first one that started a new image, that started the whole thing.
okay, I kind of misunderstood the question, but I think it adds something to the presentation to say that the neighborhood has much of its history as an agricultural transshipment and processing area. There was a huge dairy called Dean Dairy that stood on much of the land that we now recognize as the parking deck. Some of the walls of that building lasted until the parking deck was built. There was an old retaining wall, some of you might know, it was a wall of the dairy building. And on Hampshire, there's what's now a public garden on which land once stood a red brick building that was the barn, the stables, for the horses that drew the milk wagons from the dairy. And on that hunk of land that I call it Urs, where the Utrecht Art Supply place is, that that whole block between Mayfield and Hampshire is shown on a map that existed in the city's files when I was with the planning department that showed a horse guy, I'm going to say livery stable, horse trading, buggy fixing, new buggy selling sort of guy. About whom I wish I knew more than the very sketchy things that I'm able to infer from this map in the city's files.
Thank you. Pam?
Were you able to track down or have you found any of the architectural artifacts from inside the old building and where would they be? Does the district have them hidden in a warehouse somewhere?
That's a really good question, and I wish I knew the answer to it. I have a couple at home that a friend of mine stole right before the building was torn down.
Liberated.
They're very, very small things that don't really have any intrinsic value, and plus the statute of limitations is expired. But other than that, I would imagine they're some being held in some dark, secluded file by the Board of Education.
Or in a landfill.
Or in a landfill.
Severance stables.
Gosh, I hope not, because those aren't climate controlled at all. They will have molded to death.
It's a good question.
Yes, thank you. We need to do research because there was a lot. Yes.
There is a good archive of all photographs of the interior, mostly of the interior, some of the exterior of Coventry School that is still in Coventry School. The PTA cataloged it maybe 8 years ago, and it's in the library in Coventry
Yeah,
School.
we raided that.
Okay.
And there was, strangely, probably 80% of that file is photographs from the last 20 to 30 years. There aren't that many except for some classroom photos that are hard to orient oneself to, but you're right, that is the biggest collection at the moment that we were able to put our fingers on. Anyone? Steve?
If I remember correctly, one of my old maps from around 1903 called the Coventry area Fairmont. Is that right?
Yeah, the area around there was a town center about where the old city hall was, which is now the Honda, is it Honda or Toyota? Honda, on the north side of the street. That town center was called Fairmont, and that was sort of the first, in this section of Cleveland Heights, that was one of the sort of first city centers. There was a post office and I think sort of a hardware store, or, sort of a all goods type store, general store there. But we're sort of on the periphery of that, but I don't know if they really called that section Fairmont. I have an old photograph that someone donated and they didn't know anything about it that shows kids at a camp, and the sign says Camp Fairmont, and it's an old Cleveland Heights family, and my guess is it was probably somewhere, you're talking late 1800s, that there was probably some sort of camp somewhere around this town, the center of Fairmont. And that's one of the things I did neglect to say. My understanding about when the commercial district came to be called Coventry Village, I was emailing with Herb Asherman, who's a photographer who has had his offices on Coventry for some time, and he said in 1985, he sort of started using it on his letterhead, and it kind of got picked up in the late 80s as the Coventry Village.
Well, I think the real, I don't know when the term was invented, but I know that a great deal of effort was put into promoting its use in a marketing kind of way by an organization called Coventry Neighbors, which is now defunct. beginning maybe 1975 and continuing in a pretty aggressive way for the next decade or so.
So in the 70s is roughly when that, and do most people here, by a show of hands, consider Coventry Village just to be the commercial district? Or I know some
This is
people
a
who live over
survey.
here consider this to be Coventry Village as well.
We're just curious.
Which is it? Flexible. Sort of flexible.
Two things regarding Steve's comment. First of all, on the website of the Cleveland Heights Historical Society, there is a photo dating to roughly 1920 of the intersection of Superior and Mayfield, the area that Kara was referring to as Fairmount, or Fairmont. And one of the things that's interesting about that photo is that in the distance you can see some of the outbuildings that represented the very corner of the Rockefeller estate, which was catty corner from that intersection at the corner of Superior and Mayfield. Second of all, the gentleman here mentioned the Coventry Neighbors Organization, which has just gone defunct in about the last year or so. But within about the next 2 to 3 months, the Cleveland Heights Historical Society will be posting all of the archives from the Coventry Neighbors Organization on its website, if anyone cares to read its copious newsletters. Any other questions? Okay.
I'm going to close with one quote because I think it's so perfect. This was out of a Plain Dealer article, I think from the 90s. And a man who people around here may know was quoted in the article. They referred to him as a longtime Coventry person. His name was Damien Porter or Portier. Spell it, say it.
Poirier.
Poirier? Okay, Poirier, it's misspelled here. But he referred to the Coventry district as an identity crisis in transit through time. And I just, as a great way to kind of express the Coventry district. And I would like to suggest if anyone, because when I was looking through old pictures, it seems to be, people kind of know of Coventry from, the sort of 60s and 70s, and obviously I don't have any recollection of most of that time, not because of doing strange things, but because I was very little. But my question to you is, if people have old photographs of street fairs, things like that, things that were going on in the district, just some of these old pictures, I mean, you look at these pictures, even pictures from the 80s, and you're like, oh, I forgot that building. If anyone has old pictures that I would be happy to just borrow them and scan them. You could even wait while I scan them, and I could hand them back to you. Because I feel like when we look at history, we look way back. I mean, I usually look, 20s, 30s, 40s, and before. And we sort of forget about this sort of more recent history, and Coventry sort of is known for that more recent history. And I think if anyone has old pictures or knows people who have stories, and I think I might pick some of these people out of the audience and get some names and addresses so I can learn some more about this history. But if anyone knows anyone who has old pictures or things like that, I would love to, talk to you afterwards or grab my card. It's usually in the chalk tray at the back and get a hold of me. Well, thanks to everyone for coming.